Hello, my name is Brian Tucker. I am a principal consultant with Evi Jacobson International. Now, I can't claim to have been at the first PI planning event. That honor goes to friend and colleague Nick Clare, who was Dean's runner on the day. But what I can claim is to have been doing SAFE for almost 15 years. I was the first SPCT in Europe, and I've been teaching it for almost a decade. I'm also a SAFE Fellow. Oh, sorry. It's a hot day here. Here we go. So PI planning is a core mechanic within SAFE. It's one of the few things that SAFE does that is unique to it amongst all the other scaling frameworks. It's been part of the framework since the very beginning, well over a decade ago, and it's simulated as part of the Leading SAFE, Implementing SAFE, and SAFE for Teams courses. It's also taught in the Product Owner, Product Management, and Release Train Engineer courses, probably others. So surely this topic has been done to death. Well, the advice is very much open to interpretation. There is considerable flexibility in how that advice is interpreted, which can lead to both good interpretations or bad interpretations. A good interpretation promotes agility. A bad interpretation crushes it. The detractors of SAFE hold those bad interpretations up as proof that SAFE is not agile. And in some respects, they are right. A bad interpretation might not be agile, but that neglects the fact that a good implementation can be agile, very agile. So why do PI planning? Well, we do it to gain alignment. That was easy. That's what it says in the training. But why do we need to gain alignment? Well, there is more value in overall alignment than individual excellence. Don Reinertson. And if Don's quote holds true in your organization, then PI planning and the overall SAFE setup are going to be a good fit. If it doesn't hold true, if you just need lots of agile teams being individually excellent, then you don't need to collaborate. So why do we need to collaborate? Because there are a large number of people working towards a common goal. Why are there a large number of people? The first rule of scaling is don't. Don't scale if you don't have to. But sometimes we need more people. And this is where the answers start to branch. Different organizations will have different reasons. Size. To have all the knowledge to manipulate the entire system in one person or one small team is impossible. People will need to collaborate so the total body of knowledge within them can be used to build the system. Time. To realize the value in the time frame that the organization desires, then many people or teams will have to work together in parallel. Any single person or team wouldn't be able to realize the value quickly enough on their own. Another of the criticisms against SAFE is that it promotes building a bigger and bigger pyramid of people to construct and maintain systems and solutions. The detractors argue that the correct course of action is to scale down by having loosely coupled architecture that allows smaller, independent teams to release smaller pieces in their own right. And the detractors are correct. The end goal should be to scale down. But what they forget is that that is not where organizations are right now. Organizations have inherited from the past systems that are tightly coupled, that require lots of people to work on them in collaboration. They need a means of scaling agility to allow collaboration on the existing systems as they are now, so that over time, they can evolve those systems towards architectural patterns that are more suited to agility and continuous delivery. Even once you reach that nirvana of a loosely coupled, independently releasable architecture, PI planning might still be beneficial. The business request to change the bigger system will cut across the architectural landscape of independent pieces, and the teams may still need to collaborate to work out between themselves who's doing what, and when in order to achieve the bigger business request. So in this webinar, I'm going to present my interpretation of how PI planning should be done, and maybe more importantly, why I think it should be done this way. You might have a different interpretation. It might be equally good. How do you know whether it's a good interpretation? You hold it up to the principles. And if it upholds those principles, then you've got a good interpretation. So we need to look at the principles first. Well, there are 4 core values, 12 agile principles from the manifesto. There is lean, and SAFe has 10 of its own principles. Would you like me to repeat several hours of leading SAFe, or would you like me to assume that you're already familiar with them? Lean is the interesting one, particularly step 4 of lean. Let the customer pull value from the producer. We will come back to that one later. IGI's principle cards are freely available. They are great for engaging with the principles interactively by playing games with them. QR code and link at the bottom. It's not just the default principles. There are a couple of other principles that aren't enshrined in any of the other lists that have a massive influence on PI planning. The first of which is design thinking, specifically the double diamond design thinking. Separate the problem and the solution. PI planning is here. It's the boundary between the problem and solution. Everything prior to PI planning should be about understanding the problems that the organization needs the agile release train to solve. Everything after PI planning is about solving those problems. PI planning is about reaching alignment on what problems the train can solve and planning how you're going to solve them over the next 10 to 12 weeks, and who needs to be involved in developing those solutions. It becomes the transition from problem space to solution space. Autonomy. Now, I know autonomy is part of SAFe Principle 8, unlock the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. But I want to call it out here because during PI planning, we want to achieve autonomy in a fairly specific fashion. Now, I first saw this diagram as part of Henrik Nieberg's write-up of what Spotify was doing. I'm fairly sure he's taken it from somewhere else, but since I don't know exactly where, Henrik gets the credit. The horizontal axis is autonomy, the amount of choice that teams have over how they do their work. The vertical axis is alignment. Are the teams all focused on the same goal? Most organizations start off in the bottom left corner. Low autonomy. People just doing what they're told. Because they don't have a lot of choice, they're not that happy, and they're not very effective. The arrows, it's not male, female. The arrows represent the amount the teams are doing. And those arrows aren't very big. And they're all pointing in different directions. Low alignment. Not a good place to be. So what do organizations do? Let's go agile. They start adopting team-level agile practices. The teams gain autonomy. We move across the horizontal axis. The teams now have choice over how they get things done, and that allows them to do more. Those arrows have definitely grown. But this poses a challenge for the organization. How does it know whether these autonomous teams are actually fulfilling the needs of the organization? It doesn't. What's the usual response? To go command and control. The teams are back into order-taking mode. They've lost their autonomy. We've slipped back down the horizontal axis, but we've risen on the vertical axis and gained alignment. The goal is to be in the top right quadrant. This can be achieved by posing problems, challenges for the teams to align around and solve. Doing this gives them autonomy, freedom of choice over how to solve those problems. There are always constraints, the solutions they come up with, regulatory compliance. Even plain old coding standards are a constraint, but there should still be plenty of scope for negotiation over how the problem is solved. Organizations that are skeptical about letting their people think for themselves, I remind them that twice during PI planning, the accountability loop is closed to check that the plan the teams are assembling meets the expectations of the organization. And every iteration during the planning interval, the accountability loop is closed again through the system demos to check that the evolving plan and associated value delivery is meeting the expectations of the organization. Critics state that alignment takes autonomy away from the teams. You can't have both alignment and autonomy. The critics will decry that the teams no longer choose what problems they solve. And I would riposte that that depends on whether you involve them in creating the set of problems to solve. I would involve them, and they should know their system and customers better than anyone else. If they don't know their systems and customers better than anyone else, it's not a framework problem, it's an organizational problem. You've employed a bunch of people that don't know how to do their job, and for that, you only have yourselves to blame. Knowledge of the underlying principles doesn't magically happen. People need education. If you want training by some of the best in the business, people that actually know what they're talking about, follow the links. Preparation, preparation, preparation. But it has to be the right preparation. And it's not immediately obvious what the right preparation should be. But get it wrong, and you can severely compromise PI planning. When you try to decentralize decision-making, SAFe Principle 9, it's the vision that drives everything. To misquote David Marquet, the vision provides the intent to get the intent back in return. By describing where you're trying to get to, the destination, you empower people to make their own decisions about how to get there. That's the autonomy that we've just been talking about. Line up the vision with any bigger vision for the organization and make it measurable through business metrics. How does it contribute to the bottom line of the accountancy spreadsheet? Even not-for-profit organizations still need to think about the money. Often they're trying to do the most with the scarce investment they do have. The vision drives everything that follows. Roadmaps provide the look ahead to be able to ask the question, is there anything that we need to do now to prepare for the future? Future functionality might require enablers to be done now to support that future delivery. Key dates are made visible so the agile release trains can plan towards them. The roadmap represents the organization's best guess at how it thinks it could reach the destination. Do not carve it in stone. It needs to change and adjust as the organization gains insight from delivering earlier pieces of the roadmap. Its use as a forecasting tool is not to tell you that you're going to get this precise functionality at 4:13 p.m. on the second Thursday in February in 2027. The insight it gives you is, does the deadline look achievable? If the answer is no, or it's a little too close for comfort, then we need to start doing something about it now. Clear out irrelevant work, prioritize what's needed for the deadline, move investment in people, create more capacity. Do something now, because if you leave it until the deadline, it will be too late. Cast your mind back to those extra principles that I threw in, design thinking and autonomy. They apply to feature preparation. Design thinking. PI planning is the bridge between problem space and solution space. Feature preparation for PI planning is therefore in the problem space. It's a set of problems the business wants solved. Now, this could be the challenge of adding new functionality, exploring options and ideas, improving tooling and processes. Basically, any problem that needs to be solved. The important thing is that it is a problem to be solved. If it becomes a solution to be enacted, then it's going to break autonomy. When presented with solutions, teams will stop thinking for themselves. They'll just follow the instructions blindly. You've employed engineers or creative professionals. You've employed them for their knowledge, their brains. Utilize that, or you're wasting your money. How you prepare features is important as well. Again, the detractors of SAFe would suggest that it propagates the old world behaviors. I am a product manager. I tell the product owner what to do. I'm a product owner. I get my instructions from the product manager, and I tell the team what to do. We're the team. We just do as we're told. If it becomes a message passing exercise, it's very unempowering for all involved. So don't do it. Instead, what we desire is collaboration. Collapse the communication lines and get together all those that are needed to be involved in collaborating on the elaboration of a feature. The product manager is there not to dictate, but to facilitate the conversations. Facilitate the product owners talking directly to the stakeholders that are suggesting the features, and to draw into the collaboration any other subject matter experts that might have input into the feature, be that security, regulatory, architecture, or explicit business knowledge. Through the collaboration, the product owners become empowered as a collective. They now own the product. By elaborating the features, the product owners also understand those features, so that if their team selects a feature, then they are in a position to explain the business need of the feature to their team. Crafting good features is hard. It gets precious little slide time in the courses. Even the product owner, product management course doesn't really explain what makes a good feature. I wish I had more time to cover this. Thankfully, friend, colleague, and SAFe fellow Ian Spence wrote a series of articles on feature preparation, link on the slide. Socialize the features. You want the teams to have seen the features prior to PI planning. If the features are a surprise at PI planning, then the reaction from the teams is likely to be inflating the estimates because they're incorporating their surprise and uncertainty into those estimates. Therefore, socialization is good. It ensures there are no surprises. Socialization also allows the teams to sanity check the features. And if something doesn't make sense, then given that this is happening a week or two in advance of PI planning, the product management team still have time to fix any errors. What I wouldn't want, and unfortunately, most of the training material hints at doing this, is for teams to start working on the features, to start creating stories. The reasons why? Well, we'll come back to them later. Preparation of the features has taken the whole of the planning interval. Socialization of the proposed set of features takes place a week or two before PI planning and can happen without even knowing the prioritization. Prioritization happens at the last minute, often only a day or two before the PI planning. It has to occur at the last minute because it has to incorporate any work from the current PI that wasn't completed. And you'll only know what that is once you've finished the last plannable iteration within the current PI. And that remaining work has received new estimates for effort to complete. There are some subtleties to weighted shortest job first, enough to warrant their own blog post and be the topic of their own summit presentation. Links on the slide down the bottom. Long story cut short, however, estimation, the effort estimation, should be done by a sensible subset of the people on the train that do the work, the engineers, typically facilitated by the system architect. User and business value, time criticality, and risk reduction and opportunity enablement. They come from the stakeholders, the business owners, facilitated by the product manager. Weighted shortest job first is a tool for generating alignment amongst those stakeholders, agreement that this is the set of features that they want the teams within the train to try and solve. If weighted shortest job first is done by the people within the train, then it can become self-serving and any alignment to the greater business can be lost. In my experience, the planning process itself is remarkably robust. The one thing that will cause it to fail is disagreement amongst the stakeholders or between the stakeholders and the agile release train. PI planning is a garbage in, garbage out process. Feed it garbage and it will produce a plan to deliver you that garbage. Garbage is a bad backlog. So preparation, having the right backlog that everyone agrees on and is aligned around is therefore key. The backlog provides the intent that drives PI planning. Now we're going to walk through the sequence of events in PI planning. You have probably seen concrete examples of the agenda in the SAFE training material. Rather than replicate that, what I want to present here is a slightly different way of visualizing the agenda. I'm going to visualize the planning process using the W shape. The red horizontals represent the different levels of the framework, and therefore the focus of the activities that take place. At the top is the portfolio level, the bigger, wider reaching concerns. Through the middle, catching the mid-peak of the W, is the agile release train, and down the bottom is the team level. It all starts on day one with the corporate level context, which is a portfolio concern. Where is the organization trying to get to? The bigger picture, the longer term. Then we bring the horizons into this agile release train, this time box. What is it that this agile release train is trying to achieve? Whilst the focus is on planning the next PI, it's always necessary to have a little bit of a look ahead on the roadmap in case any dates or work in the future have an impact on the PI being planned. Architecture, and by extension, architecture encompasses regulatory compliance, security, UI, UX, or any other centralized specializations that might apply in your context. Architecture is a first-class citizen. They get to present the technical challenges that need to be addressed in this PI. So architecture, infrastructure, tooling, and process changes. Briefings done, team breakouts. The focus here is the teams building a plan to get themselves through the next PI. But because all the teams are planning in parallel at the same time, if a team does need help or assistance, they can collaborate with each other to resolve the challenges and factor them into each other's plans. End of day one, everyone gets back together as the agile release train, the peak of the W in the middle. And at the draft plan review, the teams present to each other their progress so far. Given that insight, the central roles can then conduct the management review, the results of which can be communicated back to the teams at the beginning of day two. Back at team level and the second breakout session. More of the same, but factoring in any advice that developed overnight. Towards the middle of day two, everyone comes back together as the agile release train, the closing activities, a final plan review, risks, commitment, and retrospective. And after the event, the commitment can be communicated up to management and across to other release trains. Up and across means that it's a portfolio concern. Distributed and dispersed planning events, the W gets spread out over more and more days as the amount of time available where the time zones overlap becomes smaller. Ultimately, it's still about 16 hours of process end to end, but spread over more, but shorter days. For large solutions, the W gets stretched upwards. There may need to be briefings for the solution train as a whole before briefings for an individual agile release train within the solution train. After the management review, there will be a solution train management review to identify and highlight challenges across the trains. The briefings. Remember your audience. Communicate to them and communicate what they need to know. For every feature being presented, only one team in the whole of the train is going to pick it up and run with it. Only that team needs to know the details. Therefore, presenting those details is a waste of all the other team's time. So keep it to what is it, why is it important, and who to talk to for the details. If you haven't yet pivoted to stream-aligned teams, then maybe highlight who you think might need to collaborate to get the value requested delivered. But don't dictate, don't break autonomy. Communicate what needs to be communicated efficiently and effectively, and you get more time for the breakout sessions, where the real work is done. The features go up on the wall, typically highest priority at the top, lowest towards the bottom. If you need a ladder and have to attend the relevant health and safety courses for working at height just to reach the top of the list, then maybe you've got the granularity of your features wrong. Physical visualization is a wonderful thing. Now, historically, for an in-person event, we would have put a small post-it note on top of a large post-it. The smaller post-it is used as a token. It is taken from the wall to indicate the teams are planning it and gets transferred to the art planning board once it has been planned. The larger post-it note provides space for teams to write their name so that we know which team is taking the lead on the feature. The product manager typically writes the post-its because they can read their own handwriting. And they'll remember to write other important bits of information, such as references to the backlog management tooling. So someone from the team, often it's the product owner, but it could be anyone from the team, goes up and pulls a feature from the prioritized set. Remember Lean's step 4. Let the customer pull value from the producer. This is that step in action. The customer, which in this instance is a team, is pulling value, the feature, from the producer, the business, as represented by the product management group that produce the backlog. The pull mechanic balances demand, the backlog, against supply, the capacity of the teams. It also helps to preserve autonomy because it allows the team's choice. So which feature should the teams take? Well, the teams are advised to take the highest priority available feature, but they are empowered to take any feature from the wall. They might not be able to take the highest priority available feature because it's not their area of expertise, and it might make more sense for the team who are experts at it to pull it. They might not be able to take the highest priority available feature because they don't have enough capacity to complete the feature. It's better to find something that can be completed rather than having an incomplete feature at the PI boundary where it has the potential to become waste if the remainder isn't prioritized in the next PI. What the team isn't allowed to do is to go rummaging off into the depths of the backlog management tooling to try and find something to work on. Got it. This is ours. This is our feature, number 99 on the priority list. When does the organization need feature number 99? Not anytime soon. Certainly not this PI. Otherwise, it would have been on the wall. If there is nothing that the team can take, then they just have to take something from the wall and learn how to do it. The advantage is that next time around, the team will have a greater breadth of experience and can take more from the backlog. Keep this up long enough and complex subsystem teams slowly evolve towards being more stream-orientated as they continuously learn. And isn't that a core competency or something? But wait, cried the management. If we give the inexperienced team that feature, it will take them twice as long to get it done as it would the expert team. Yes, it would. The expert team would complete the feature quicker, but they've already got several months of work queued up in front of them. So you'll still get the value quicker, even if it takes the inexperienced team twice as long to do it, because they can do it now. Think cost of delay rather than maximum utilization. And don't invent work to keep teams busy. That's waste. If the team is doing wasteful invented work, if the team doing wasteful inventive work needs help from other teams, then that's imposing on teams who might be trying to do real work. That's waste squared, and the wasteful work starts inhibiting value delivery. So the teams have pulled a feature, they can leave their team name behind, and the product owner, having helped elaborate the business needs in the feature, can explain what that need is to the team. At worst, they know who the expert is and can grab them and drag them across the room to explain the detail to the team. The team can then create a set of stories to solve the business challenge of the feature. This is story genesis, story creation, forming a new team backlog for the next 10 to 12 weeks. Don't expect perfection. The stories don't need to be perfect. A couple of words is often enough. The team still have backlog refinement and iteration planning to get the stories into the perfect form for execution, properly worded in user voice format with well-formed acceptance criteria on the back. For the purposes of planning, all that's needed is enough detail to allow the team to estimate, to reserve space in the forthcoming iterations, to make sure the team isn't overcommitting, that they aren't taking on too much work. This is where the challenge lies. Teams often forget they're planning to solve the problems in execution and instead try to solve all the problems in planning. There is only 8 hours of team breakout time for planning, not enough to solve all the problems posed in the features. There's 8 weeks of execution in which to solve the problems. Why do some teams feel the need to ensure that they have an absolutely perfect plan? It's probably history at fault. Now, I always say that estimation has 2 parts to it. Knowledge of the work item being estimated, but also knowledge about ourselves as a team, that we have the skills and expertise to solve these problems in the future. Many teams lack confidence in their own abilities to get things delivered as a team, and they try to compensate by putting more and more detail into the work item being estimated, often to the extent where they've solved the work item up front in order to produce that estimate. The real fix is not more and more detail around the work, but to upskill the team so that they do have the confidence that they can solve the problems they're estimating without necessarily having all the detail present about how the problem will be solved. In the old world, if the estimates were wrong and the plan was compromised, then the wrath of the project managers would rain down from on high. And woe betide any software engineer that got their estimates wrong due to insufficient data or analysis. The old world's lack of psychological safety drove the wrong behaviors. But just because we've said we're agile and we're doing agile processes doesn't mean the behaviors have changed yet. Old behaviors die hard. So we don't need a perfect plan. We need enough to ensure that we're taking on the right amount of work, and that we found all the collaborations, the dependencies between the teams. Welcome to the Agile Arts and Crafts project. We can use colors to represent different categories of work: business value, architecture, exploration, infrastructure, risks and issues. The actual colors you choose is somewhat irrelevant and mostly dependent upon the color of post-it notes that you have access to. What's important is that you do have color. Standing at the front of a big room or on a digital whiteboard zoomed right out to see everything, you can't read the post-it notes, but you can see their color. In the Western world, red is the warning color. Red is risks, red is errors. And that team over there, they've got all the red post-it notes. Why? Maybe I should go over and find out what's going on. For the central roles of product management, system architect, release train engineer, and the stakeholders, the business owners, the colors become a visible trigger to go and have a conversation. It's good to talk. Get all the problems off your chest. Now we can turn our attention to objectives. As the work is planned out, it gets described in objectives. High-level, human-readable statements of where our team's time and effort is going to be spent. Objectives are not just a translation of the features. They describe everything that the team intends to spend its time on. And teams do more than just deliver features. So what are the sources of objectives? Well, I would suggest that features make good objectives. But it's not just a feature becomes an objective, because features are negotiated during PI planning. The scope may change. Make that transparent in your objectives. Large features might be deliverable incrementally. We could express each of these increments as an objective in its own right. Think MVP experiments and risk mitigation. Helping another team to deliver a feature makes a good objective, and the teams that you're delivering to will be listening out to see whether you're delivering to them what they need. Teams should always be empowered to put their own work into their backlogs and plans. The internal work that they know they need to do to keep the lights on, to keep the world turning. But they have to be transparent about this, so turn it into objectives to make it visible. Finally, capacity allocations are used to deal with the known unknowns. Support, defects, incident handling. We know it's going to happen. We just don't know what it's going to be until the phone rings and, But because we know it happens, we can set time aside, reserve capacity. Honoring our core value of transparency, we need to make it visible this has happened, not least because whoever's managing the defects is going to want to know that capacity has been put aside. SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. The default time bounds for an objective is the planning interval. Don't constrain yourself unnecessarily. Give yourself the ability to move things around during execution. But if you do need to constrain yourself to something tighter, say collaborations or explicit deadlines, then do so. I prefer to use the name of milestones rather than explicit date or an iteration number, since the name of the milestone means more to humans than a date does. Objectives are another deep topic that gets very little slide time in the trainings, which is worrying since it's objectives that we commit to. And if they're badly formed, then the commitment is badly formed. Links on the slide to articles describing objectives in more detail. Once the stories from the feature have been created, estimated, and allocated to their candidate iterations, then the ticket for the feature can be transferred to the other output from the PI planning event, the ART planning board. There are columns for each plannable iteration, typically smaller columns on the right the innovation and planning iteration, and the next planning interval. We're not expecting work to be planned into those last two columns, but we do need to know if there are any key dates that need to be planned towards. And just imagine that you have a release scheduled for the beginning of the next PI. When's the work going to be done? In the next PI? No, it's all happening in this one. So you need that look ahead to be able to allow the teams to answer the question, is there anything we need to do now to support the future? There are rows for each team, typically rows towards the bottom for shared services such as architecture, security, and UX, rows for other release trains that you collaborate with regularly, and a row for any external dependencies. Once a team understands when they think they can get a feature delivered, then the feature ticket is transferred to the program board in the iteration where they anticipate delivery to occur. Dependencies. Oh, how I hate that word. Dependency implies helplessness. And within the release train, we're not helpless. We are a team of agile teams. We work together. We collaborate. Although if you are taking a SAFe exam after this, it will be referred to as dependencies, since you are helpless in an exam situation. You have to be careful with words, you know. They have power. Anyhow, how do we handle collaborations between the teams? Well, the first rule of the program board is you're only allowed to put tickets into your row. If you have a collaboration with another team, the first thing to do is negotiate with that team to get what you need from them represented in their backlog. They can then summarize whatever they're doing for you in a pink ticket and put it up on the program board in the iteration where they intend to honor the collaboration. The stickies can then be linked together with string. I always carry a ball of wool with me, just in case I ever get caught in a PI planning event. In the digital realm, electronic string is available. What I haven't been able to replicate in the digital realm is the embarrassment of having your scissors confiscated from you by security at the airports. Now, string represents a collaboration that's been identified by the teams and that will ultimately be realized by the teams. To steal a quote from Henrik Nieberg, a centralized tool for visualizing decentralized collaborations and delivery, built by the teams for the teams. Any critic that thinks this is an imposition hasn't understood how it can and should be done. The program board is a hugely powerful visualization tool. It doesn't just show anticipated value, delivery, and collaborations. You can also see deficiencies in your organizational structure as well. That's a topic for another day. Feel free to follow the link in the slide where it is discussed. Now, this team can go back and pull more features until they fill their capacity. The other teams have been busy pulling features and negotiating until they have filled their capacity. We're now at the presentations. Read the objectives. Just read them. They should be an accurate representation of where your team's time and effort is going to be spent. If you feel that you need to explain the objectives beyond what was written, then maybe the objectives weren't well written. My experience is that engineers have a tendency to tokenize the objectives, to condense them into as few words as possible, rather than them being a human readable statement. Remember your audience. They don't care about all the internal problems that you have to solve. They want to hear about outwards delivery of value, where you're helping them, the very things that should be expressed in objectives. My experience with managers and some agile coaches is that they can make the objectives too aspirational, too high level. This team intends to save the world. Can they really do that on their own? In the next planning interval? And how are we going to measure whether they've achieved it? Objectives are statements of where the team intends to put its time and effort, real concrete things they are doing. When you're presenting, everyone listens. Everyone. Is this team delivering to you what you need? If you are a team member in another team, are they delivering to you what you and your team needs? If you represent the business, is the team delivering what the business needs? If the answer is no, then that's a trigger for conversations within the team in the next breakout. The management review. And a little structure here goes a long way. You can't and shouldn't try to preempt the conversations in the management review because anything could happen in the next half hour. But some structure can help drive the conversations towards conclusions. I would start at the backlog. And the question being asked here is, have the right features been taken? This is where you need to know the available capacity from the draft plan review. We're asking that not to check that the teams have planned up to their capacity. We trust them to be sensible and have a little bit of slack left there. What we want to know is what capacity is still available for planning. If we're looking at the backlog and there are half the features left on the wall, and the teams have told us that there is half the capacity still available for planning, then it's a fairly reasonable assumption that most of those features are going to end up in that free capacity on day 2 of planning. But if the teams have said there's only a small amount of capacity left for planning and half the features are still left on the wall, then some tough decisions have to be made. Have the right features been taken? Which features should claim the little capacity that's left? Here begins the facilitation challenge. It's very easy for the management to lapse into command and control behavior. You, yes, you laddie, that's your feature. Get on and plan it. Are you feeling empowered? Lose that empowerment, that autonomy, and PI planning quickly becomes the old world of telling people what to do, just with some new agile buzzwords added in. Instead, what we need is that all of the advice is posed as problems, challenges to solve. The top right quadrant from the earlier alignment and autonomy diagram. If anyone is worried that the teams won't solve the problems, remind them that at the final plan review on day 2, they can always reject the plan if the teams haven't solved the challenges presented. From the backlog, it's usually a short stroll or scroll in the digital world across to the planning board. The question here is, are the features coming out in the right sequence? The visualization allows you to see the bottlenecks, any challenging dependency chains, and are the teams planning towards the key dates? Structural issues also appear here. Complex subsystem teams will appear as lines of pink collaborations on the planning board. Are they becoming a bottleneck? The third step is to tour the teams themselves. This is being done not to critique the team plans. If people want to get involved in the plan detail, do that in the breakout sessions. The tour is to look at the risks. And at this stage, risks can go 3 ways. Team level risks. We will politely reflect them back into the team and get the team to build a plan that deals with it. Missing information. The central roles, with their knowledge and contacts, might be able to get that information back to the team for the second breakout on day 2. The team can then incorporate that information into the plan and de-risk the situation. And finally, true program level risks. These we would encourage to be brought up at the relevant point on day 2. That little bit of structure, backlog, planning board, risks, is often enough to drive the conversations towards conclusions. So who's involved? Who are the management? Well, the central roles for the Agile release train of product manager, system architect, and release train engineer, also the stakeholders, the business owners. And then I would suggest that at least one representative from each team to provide any team level details and insight, and to relay any team specific advice back to the team directly, the sort of stuff that doesn't need to be broadcast to the train as a whole. There are tales to tell from management reviews, but not enough time to tell them here. So as always, more insight in the link in the corner. From a team perspective, the team breakouts on day 2 are much the same as day 1, but there is one additional activity that happens here. The business owners are asked to get out amongst the teams and score the objectives. And there are 3 reasons for doing this. It acts as a forcing function to get the stakeholders to engage with the objectives and understand those objectives. What we don't want is to get to the end of planning and be in the final plan reviews and have a stakeholder turn around and say, "What on earth is this? What are you doing?" And to then spend time explaining to the stakeholder what's going on, whilst the entire art, all 100 people, are sat around watching and waiting. It's not a useful use of everyone's time. So have those conversations in the breakouts directly between team and stakeholder. The number acts as a data point for the team to help with team level prioritization. The team is always in control of how they sequence stories in their backlogs. This is just an input. But when the bad things happen, and they will, and the team has to prioritize and decide what to focus on, the score lets them know which objectives the business considers most important. Because the objectives are a superset, it's all the other things the team does over and above just the features. It allows the business to rank those other things like support, maintenance, and local work. They can all be positioned relative to the features. Finally, these numbers will be used to close the loop at the end of the planning interval. Because the most important objectives get the higher number, the closing will naturally be weighted towards the most important objectives. More detail and experiences in the objectives blog link in the corner. Risks. I'm not going to cover the whole roaming process. That's already in the training material. But what I want to do is talk about ownership. How do you determine ownership? Once a risk has been identified as needing to be owned, I would ask the train, can anyone volunteer to take ownership of this risk? The act of volunteering, of pulling the risk towards them, is hugely important. It's them psychologically taking ownership of the risk. Push a risk onto someone, and they're more likely to reject it, to ignore it. And we don't want that. We want the risks to be properly owned and for people to be actively managing them. What if nobody volunteers? Well, the default owner becomes the release train engineer. Not that they have to manage the risk, but they should work out who should own it and politely encourage them to volunteer. Given that these are train level risks and above, it's a high likelihood that it will need train level people or above to own these risks. Do the teams think they can deliver this plan? The commitment they're being asked to make is in 2 parts. Firstly, they agree to deliver the objectives that they've just set for themselves through the planning process. But in the event that facts show that an objective is not achievable, then teams agree to escalate immediately. The escape clause is pure transparency. Don't hide the bad news, get it out in the open so the bigger team of teams, the Agile release train, can try to deal with it before it escapes outside the Agile release train. I always advise the teams to build a plan that they can commit to. There's no point deliberately sending yourself around the replanning loop. And most engineers are fairly sensible. They work out pretty quickly that building a plan they can commit to is the easiest course of action. In terms of practicalities, I go team by team, then the Agile release train as a whole, including all the central roles and stakeholders. The commitment is as much the central roles to the teams as it is the teams to the central roles. You've gained commitment. When was the last time that you had commitment to a plan from the people expected to enact the plan? That's possibly worth a celebration. Unfortunately, however, the process isn't over just yet. We need to conduct a retrospective. And this is important because when do you think preparation for the next PI planning begins? Right here, right now. If we need to make any changes to the preparation, we need to know about them now. It can't be deferred until the big retrospective at the end of the planning interval, because that will be too late. However, we do need to remember that we are at the end of 16 physically and mentally draining hours. So the retrospective needs to be kept short and to the point. Personally, I use the post-it note game, good, bad, change, because teams tend to be familiar with it. I give each team 5 minutes for an individual brainstorming, and the central roles can participate by forming their own team. I then give them 5 minutes to compare their ideas as a team. And then I ask each team in turn to present 3 things from any of the categories to get a quick readout from the whole of the room. And it's always gratifying the teams raise the good things they want to keep as much as they complain about the bad things. After the event, the Scrum Master and release train engineer can collect all the retrospective points in and process them offline. Data entry is not a spectator sport. Transfer the data into any online tooling after the event. Use the time in planning to discuss, negotiate, and collaborate. It's the one time when everyone is together where conversations can happen in real time. Using it for the individual activity of data entry is a waste of that precious time. Be wary of the tooling. Teams become obsessed about keeping the tooling up to date, so the tooling can create them the perfect picture. I always favor the simplest tooling possible. Post-it notes in the physical world, online whiteboards in the digital world, to encourage individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Now, no process will be perfect. Retrospection and adaptation is a necessity. But here be dragons. Be wary. It's very easy to inspect and adapt away from the fundamental principles if you don't understand the principles that form the foundations of PI planning. Too much preparation is bad. The reasons shown here are taken from an exercise in the last RTE course. But to summarize, if we over-prepare, if the problems posed in the features have been solved before PI planning, then the teams will stop thinking for themselves. They'll just sequence the work and complain that planning is boring. Teams will also struggle to ignore sunk costs. They'll defend their plan rather than accepting change when other teams come along with requests for help. If we underprepare, if the problems aren't well described, then this will result in more conversations during planning. But those are the very interactions we're trying to encourage. As long as someone from product management can explain the business need, then PI planning will work. And I have participated in planning events where the features are nothing more than a few words on a post-it note and a very knowledgeable product manager. The plan is being made in the moment. There is little to no sunk costs. Changing it is considerably easier when the teams start to interact. In reality, It's not a simplistic over preparation or under preparation. It's doing the right preparation. That left-hand diamond of design thinking is our guide. Features are the business challenges to pose the teams that then come up with the engineering solutions. The right preparation is understanding the business need to be able to explain it to the teams, to help them understand when they've created a sensible solution. The desire to over-prepare is actually a symptom. Doing more preparation is a solution, and we might be solving the wrong problem. So we could break out the old 5 whys to try and find a root cause. Why do teams want to over-prepare? They're trying to preempt planning. Why are they trying to preempt planning? Well, they're scared of uncertainty and want to have solved all the problems in the features in advance. Why are they scared of uncertainty? Historically, they may have been punished for being wrong. Well, that needs to change. Psychological safety is a key part of the generative culture we're trying to encourage. But they may also lack the knowledge, often because despite being employed as engineers, they've traditionally been treated as glorified typists and expected to just enact solutions handed down rather than learning how to solve the problems themselves. There may be the desire for a perfect plan. The aforementioned historic punishment might be one reason for that. Another is often that there is no slack. The demand significantly outweighs the supply, and to be in with half a chance of meeting the management's unrealistic expectations, the plan has to be perfect. Why the unrealistic expectations? Lack of management understanding, either in what the processes are capable of, or perhaps sensible data to show what the teams are capable of. Lack of understanding is one of the reasons the right metrics aren't being gathered, and lack of investment in infrastructure, processes, and tooling due to a lack of understanding about the necessity of maintaining the machinery of development also feeds into this. Sometimes the desire to preempt planning is because of a desire to squeeze the planning into a single day. Why do you want to squeeze it into a single day? Often PI planning is not perceived as valuable, but just a single day of executing a bad plan will cost more than an extra day of planning. Squeeze planning into a single day and lose the time for negotiation. The management also lose their steering point, that is the management review. They no longer have the ability to influence the planning, to provide feedback before the final plan review. Why do they not perceive it as valuable? Well, again, it's back to a lack of understanding, not just of the process, but why the process does what it does. And you can't get ahead in a cyclic system. You're chasing your tail. Teams forget they're in a cyclic situation, trying to preempt planning, and solving things up front is just eating into the delivery of the current plan and making it unpredictable. Why not use the planning process to plan how you intend to solve the problems? It's getting over that perception the plan has to be perfect and has to contain all of the answers. Need a big architectural discussion? Stick a story in the plan. Negotiate one into the system architect's plan. Discover the answers as you go. Need to do some research, build a prototype, stick a story in the plan to get those answers. Need to gain skills to prepare for the future? Stick stories into the plan. You're planning to solve the problems. Don't try and solve all the problems in planning or preparation for planning. Now, retrospectives turn bad very quickly when you don't see anything come of them. Therefore, it is necessary to close the retrospective loop. Make sure that at least some of the retrospective points are enacted. Some are easy. The coffee in this hotel is awful. Well, that was fixed by the senior business owner turning up at the next PI planning event with 2 Nespresso machines and a bag full of capsules. It's more challenging when the changes are happening behind the scenes, away from the eyes of the engineering staff on the train. An example of this would be better formed features. This is done by the product management group away from the engineering staff. It might be necessary to take a little time at the next planning event to let the engineering staff know that the product management have tried to improve the features. Please give us more feedback this time round. It took just one sentence, but through that sentence, the retrospective loop has been closed, the hidden changes made visible. All the planning events happen in parallel. This is important. It allows one train to negotiate work into another just by calling them up and negotiating in real time. Sometimes there is a desire to stagger the planning so that stakeholders can attend more than one planning, but this causes problems when trains interact. The trains that end up planning first impose their commitments on the trains that plan later. And those trains have no way of negotiating back because the plans have been done and the plans committed. All the latter trains can do is suck it up and deal with the imposed work. It doesn't promote autonomy, and it gives SAFE a bad reputation because the empowerment that SAFE promised hasn't been granted. Although that's not the fault of the framework, but the fault of a bad implementation. Line everything up and learn how to decentralize decision-making. Dispersed and distributed planning is a big topic in its own right, more than I can sensibly cover here. Links to the articles on the slide. So there we are, 15 years of accumulated experience of PI planning distilled down into some 60 minutes. Hopefully we've peered behind the what to do and we've seen some of the why it's done, so that when you come to interpret the process to suit your particular environment, you know how to interpret it sensibly. PI planning itself is neither agile nor unagile. It's as agile as you want to make it. Planning, after all, is a human activity done by humans for the benefit of humans, and agility is a human behavior, not a process. Interpret those processes wrong, and you will compromise the ability of the individuals involved to display those agile behaviors. The processes have to be left open to interpretation because every organization and the challenges they face are unique. And those processes need to be adapted to that uniqueness. Remember, this is my interpretation. You may interpret things differently and still maintain agility, hold true to those underlying principles. There's a long list of people, a list as long as my arm, that should be thanked. Most obviously being my fellow consultants, Eva Jacobson, who have either directly or indirectly provided insight and assistance at PI planning events. Notably my fellow trainers, Ian Spence, Keith Mendoza, and Marie Gazette, and fellow facilitators, Mike Flynn and Avril Franklin. I also need to acknowledge a huge debt of gratitude to all the participants in the PI planning events over the years. It's been a constant learning experience, both good times and bad. Somehow, we've always managed to make PI planning work. It's always produced a plan, and the credit there has to go to the participants rather than to me. Was the plan what the business wanted? Sometimes the business didn't know, but you can't blame PI planning for a business's lack of vision. If you've never done PI planning before, it's a daunting task. There is training to explain what's happening, but for many, some guidance to steer them through their first PI planning event is very useful. You want people that have done it before, seen the situations, know how to read the room. There aren't many consultancies with comparable length and depth of experience. Follow the link if you need help or with training or support. Now, there was a pre-webinar activity asking how would you prioritize a set of activities leading into PI planning? I would be concerned about feature preparation. Do the features meet ourselves? Are they ready for PI planning? You need to make sure the teams have the right knowledge so they can perform PI planning itself. And the backlog needs to be prioritized. So we clearly know what's most important, what's least important, because that makes sure we're dealing with the right things. And as we saw earlier, it brings everyone into alignment. Define what needs to be measured so we can create a predictable PI plan in order to build trust. How do we know we're doing the right things? And we need to ensure we've got psychological safety within the teams so the participants can participate and ask questions without fear. Finally, equip the management team with the ability to perform the management duties in a valuable way. What's their management duties? Make sure we have a clear vision for the art, what it needs to try and accomplish, and everything else descends from there. So that's it. We've got time for some questions, but having been talking for the last hour, I have no idea what they are. So I'm going to need to hand over to one of my colleagues to pick through the question and answers, and we'll see what challenges you're experiencing and what you're facing.
Great. Well, I have a list of questions that I've been collecting from the Q&A and the chat during, so I'll go through them during in the order they came up. So the first one was by Lucas Miller, and he was saying, in my experience, if the teams don't have time to work on story breakdown in advance, they don't have enough time to work through all other activities requested of them. Any advice on how to break stories out, acceptance criteria, sizing and priority in the breakout session? So I think you touched on that, but would you like to sort of summarize your points?
Yeah, I mean, this is one where if you try and do all this in advance, you end up eating into your preceding plan. The question to ask is, why do they feel they need to do it in advance? What's going on there that means they have to get an absolutely perfect plan? Can you not transfer some of that detail, the actual problem solving, into the execution of the plan? Remember, we're planning to solve the problems, not trying to solve them in planning. It's one of those that's really difficult to answer in a session like this, because we really need to dive into the specifics of what's actually going on in your circumstances, in your space. But it's a fairly common problem. You know, you're not alone out there. There's lots of people that want to have solved all the problems prior to PI planning. And that is challenging, because if it turns out you can't do the feature, then all that preparation has become waste. And we're trying to eliminate waste. That's one of the key goals of Lean. So the real challenge is to defer that sort of thing, push it right down into a execution. Shift left all of that activities around what is the business need we need to solve, and properly understanding the business need and any other constraints that may come along with that, such as regulatory, compliance, security, and whatnot.
Thank you. Let me go to another one. Christine was asking, where did I find it? Could you give an example of an objective, like a PI objective regarding capacity reservations? I have a hard time exemplifying for my own understanding.
So fairly simple. These are the really easy ones to write. an amount of time, a percentage of the team's time is set aside for defect fixing or support or incident handling. The concreteness is, as in the specific and measurability, is stating what you're actually going to use the capacity for. So things like the defect fixing, support, incident handling, that makes it specific. And the measurability is there in terms of how much time you're putting aside, and we can measure that. The teams themselves, as they do the support handling, they can record the amount of time they've spent on it, and we can then assess that at the end of the PI. And that then feeds back into how much time do you need to reserve in the next planning interval. If you've had a lot of problems, then maybe you need to put it up. If you didn't utilize all of your time, then you can possibly reduce the amount that you're setting aside. And of course, if you don't utilize the time, the capacity, then just pull more work forwards. There's always more work on the backlog, either your own backlog as a team, or you maybe can go to the product manager. Have they got any small features that you can try and squeeze in at the end of the planning interval? There will be examples in the blog as well, so follow the links on the slides. We will make these slides available after the presentation. Don't know exactly how or where just yet, but it will happen, and we'll send an email out to everyone regarding that.
Great, thank you. Vincent Ryan, he asked any advice on writing objectives as OKRs, and I put in the chat the safe advice, which was don't, because they take too long to write in the limited time of planning, and often the key results are laggy indicators. But any thoughts about that, Brian?
Yeah, the actual full-blown OKRs are probably a bit of overkill for objectives which we just need to get done in the next 2 or 3 months. Something simpler is usually sufficient. That said, the sort of format of what you're trying to achieve, but how you intend to measure it, can be quite useful, because it focuses the team on how do we intend to measure whether we are successful. But the objectives here at the team level within PI planning, they are much more concrete actions, things the team intends to do, rather than the more aspirational objectives which OKRs typically represent. So I wouldn't steer too much towards fully fledged OKRs, but you might find just hijacking the format in terms of the results, being able to explain how you intend to measure the results actually is quite beneficial.
Great, okay. Thomas Hansen asked a good question. He said, why do we prioritize features then when PI objectives are prioritized?
Well, features are the input, so we need to have a priority on the input. And the inputs, it is an absolute priority, highest priority at the top. They are stack ranked down below that. The objectives aren't actually prioritized, they are scored. And that score is a number between 1 and 10. Most important objectives get the higher numbers, least important get the bottom. And it's a range, and we want the range, but equally, the objectives could share the same score. There could be some very high objectives, important objectives, they all get 10s. Equally, you have some other objectives which get lower numbers because they are less important. So you can share numbers with the scoring on the objectives. We always try to encourage a range. If everything is 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, then that actually gives the team no insight. So it's effectively worthless. We do want that range. And most stakeholders, most business owners are intelligent enough to work out that a range is good, and that just because you've scored something, it's not actually a guarantee that it's going to get done. So Providing the range gives the team insight to make sensible, decentralized prioritization decisions at point of need as they encounter the challenges when they're executing the plan.
Thank you. Just going through them more. Praveen Campbell asked, will having an anonymous retrospective help get better feedback? That's quite an interesting question.
Maybe, maybe not. The question would probably be to pose, would be, why do you want an anonymous retrospective? Probably there's issues with psychological safety in there to begin with, and maybe we need to go off and deep dive on those and try and fix those first. Most of my experience, the issues coming up in the retrospectives about the PI planning, they tend not to be personal challenges, as in challenges against individuals or teams. It tends to be more around the process, particularly in the early days, and issues around the process. So by that very nature, whether anonymous or not, it doesn't really matter. They're not something that you tie back to an individual anyway. But you could run it anonymously if you wanted to. The challenge there is you're not going to be able to get a quick readout from the room, which is often nice because you want to see if patterns are coming through from multiple teams, because they're going to feed everything through anonymously. But yeah, why do you want it anonymously would be the first question to ask, and then dive on that. That's one to break out the old 5 whys technique.
There's a question from Lukas Sushanek. Looking at the ARC planning boards, it seems that the teams plan features, not stories, but the features are deliberately defined as multi-team owned, or they could be, Lukas, they don't have to be, it just depends on how they fall. Thus rendering us with the necessity to define a leading team for a feature. Currently, we don't do that as of now. Is that the way to solve it? And what would be the suggestion to break through this? So I think the answer is yes, that is a good practice to have a team, a leading team, so that they are the ones that then go and talk to the other teams that they know they need to work together in order to deliver that feature. And you also just need to make sure that the same team doesn't end up being the leading team with lots of features in the same PI planning, because they'll give themselves too much burden. So that's something that the train level roles like the RTE might just watch out for while the planning is taking place.
Yes. Spread that around so that different teams take the lead on different features to avoid the overloading. And also the act of the teams taking the lead on the feature is another decentralization technique in its own right. It's empowering them to take on more responsibility rather than expecting RTEs and other centralized roles to be managing all of this for them.
Great. Jeremy had a question, Jeremy Neidegger. He said, decentralized decision-making to promote autonomy. A seemingly simple sentence, but we'd love to explore in more depth and hear from leaders who have had success with this. It ain't easy. Doing more planning in parallel would certainly help to avoid bottlenecks. So there's quite a big topic there, really.
Oh yeah, huge topic, and one that Scaled Agile have actually revisited fairly recently. If you go back into the SAFE's big picture and click on the principles and principle 9, you'll see that they've just reworked principle 9, decentralized decision making. And that was the topic of Dean and Andy's sort of keynote presentation at the recent summit in Nashville earlier in August. The challenge there is always having clarity of vision, what it is you're trying to achieve. And then once you've got that clarity of vision, you can start to empower people to work out at their level how they achieve that vision. And this becomes a cascading process as well. The vision for the company as a whole breaks down into visions for pieces of the company, which breaks down into visions for what should my train or my team do next, which breaks down into what do I do as an individual to achieve my team vision? And the team vision is achieving the next one up and up. So there are feedback loops should be running all the way through here. How do you know whether those feedback loops are working? Well, all of those visions, they need to be measurable in some manner. Now, for teams and trains, it might be things like their objectives at the iteration level, at the planning interval level. It may be looking at KPIs and other metrics from an individual release train. That in turn will feed up into more metrics at the higher levels of the organization as a whole, so you can see that you're moving in the right direction. Getting all those feedback loops set up, so you've got a vision, you've got a way of measuring it that we can then feed back in. It is a non-trivial endeavor. And it's a space where you're quite right. A lot of organizations, if they haven't historically had this in place before, they can need some support and help in order to get that set up. And training and education as well. Because if you're not used to how all these things run, because you're used to an old world type process, all of this behaves very differently, particularly at the top, from what people may have been used to. But that's why people like myself, Keith, who is reading out all the questions, that's why we're here to provide that insight, that training, that support should you need it.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah. And of course, it depends what do you mean by decentralization, depending on where you are in the organization. So you can't decentralize absolutely everything. Number 8, Rena was asking about tooling. She said, can you suggest online tools for data entry after PI planning, and what sort of data is crucial to be entered and tracked? Which is a very open question, Rena, because there are plenty of online tools like Jira or version 1 or Rally, or I suspect even does PIplanning.io allow you to track it after PI planning? Maybe.
No idea. Now, we tend to be fairly tooling agnostic. What I will say, though, is you probably do want tooling to track your backlog once you've created it in PI planning. And the reason for this is the metrics about how well your team is running. Post-it notes are great, and they're great for generating conversations about people and visualizing the progress of things. What they're very bad at is timestamps, because you need the human involved to write the timestamp on the post-it note. The tooling, the online tooling, is very good at timestamping everything, because at its heart, it's just a database, and everything in a database gets timestamped. So if you want the sort of metrics that are how long did something take, how long was it in a certain stage of the process, and statistics around those sort of timing type aspects, that's when you really need that online tooling, because it can produce all of that for you in abundance. The downside with all the online tooling is you have to keep it up to date. That's the data entry challenge. And if you want to actually see what's going on, you have to go into the tool. Whereas post-it notes on a wall next to you, they're always there, they're always present. So there is no right answer to that. And we probably haven't provided a particularly satisfying answer in suggesting one tool over another. You really have to work out what's the best fit for you and your way of working. All of the tools appear to work, and pretty much over the years, we've seen every tool being used in some manner or other. So, it's just which one is best for you.
Yeah, and which one your company is happy to have licenses for, with the cost side of things as well.
Yeah,
basically. Okay. Michelle Walton was asking, Well, you said, Brian, that teams should bring their own internal work as well as working on features. So, any thoughts about what the recommended percentage split between business features and team raised? Michelle wrote epics, but I guess they'd be team raised features. If not, what principle would you apply to guide the teams on what is reasonable? This is capacity allocation, I suppose.
And this is another one, which is how long is a piece of string? Every sort of scenario, every organization is going to be different. So putting a number on, almost impossible. The important thing to do probably is to try and make the internal work visible, particularly if it's never been visible before. And then once it's visible, once we can now see it in the team level plans, then we can have conversations about it. Is it important? Should we be doing it? And some is important. It is necessary to keep the company running, and we should probably let that stand. Other things that teams are doing are self-serving bits of work. They want to do it for their own possibly selfish reasons. Maybe that work shouldn't stand and we should remove it from the plan. So rather than focus on trying to nail down an absolute percentage, what I would do is try and get all of that work visible, because once you can see it, you can manage it. And we want to be in a position where we can manage these things. So make it visible. That core principle of transparency. Where I would set up an explicit split, percentage split, is between the business requests and the architecture requests. Now, architecture, the enablers, yes, these are internally generated work as well, but it's slightly more centrally internally generated because it's coming from the architect group, which is system architect, but add into that regulatory compliance, UI, UX, somebody representing the tooling and processes, probably the RTE, all of those as well. You want a capacity split there, so there's always a chance of getting some of those fixes done. So yeah, no, and again, one of those that, because it ends up being very situation specific, it's not necessarily a particularly satisfying answer to be giving. Can't sort of say it should be 20/80, 30/70, but you have to work it out for yourself. And the process to get to that number is to have transparency to begin with.
In some materials, Michelle, people talk about 20% for internal, kind of architectural improvements is a good sort of rough sort of figure, but it does depend on what they're actually working on. And that doesn't necessarily cover individual things that teams want to do. That might be more strategic stuff, as Brian said, the architectural things.
Yeah. And also the percentage balance may change over the lifetime of a product. Where you are first putting it together and there's a lot of infrastructure and scaffolding for a new product to be put in place, then maybe the balance is more tilted towards the enablers. As you get out of that and into actually delivering business value, maybe it skews the other way. So these figures are never fixed either. They need to be reassessed periodically.
Great. So Jalal Hijazi has given you a safe test, multi-choice test, Brian. He says, who is responsible for ensuring quality is built into the code in SAFe? A, testers, B, product owners, C, developers, D, agile teams. There's no E, everyone.
Well, the nearest I get to everyone is agile teams. It is a collaborative effort to get quality built in. Everyone has input to it, particularly the engineering staff. And quality is something you need to think about at the start, not at the end. So when you're doing PI planning, you should have a definition of done for features. And the feature level definition of done is going to tell you all of the things you need to be building into a feature in order to say that you've created a good quality feature. There'll be things like bigger tests. We're going to need to update paperwork at a feature level, like regulatory compliance and internal documentation. And there may be things we need to build into the feature that we know about but haven't come through from the business, like metrics, logging, error handling, and debug functionality. And if you're in the physical space, there are physical equivalents, access hatches for fixing and maintaining mechanical equipment is the equivalent of a software debug statements and stuff. The usefulness of your definitions of done is not as a checklist to use at the end, but a checklist to use during planning. Have we planned to build quality in, to do all of the activities? They should be stories in a backlog somewhere. Maybe our team's backlog, maybe we've negotiated them into other teams' backlogs because they've got specialist skills we need, but utilize them during the planning activities. Definition of done for stories, you need that in order to give you insight into how much effort is going to be involved so you can do those estimates. So yeah, it's everyone's responsibility. I would pull that option E. And it's everyone's responsibility to also check that through the planning process, we are building quality in, as well as checking it at the end. But if it's in the plan, we should have built it in, so the checks at the end just become a formality rather than a turn back and do it again type job.
Great. There is a question, as an RTE, how can I control my eager teams who want to plan everything before the PI planning? And I think you spoke a fair amount about that. But any tactics to kind of discuss with them about why that may be a waste?
Short of sitting down and talking to them and getting your scrum masters to actively restrain them from processing too much, that's all you can do. You've got to sit down and educate and coach, basically. The thing to do, as always, is ask the question, why do they want to get ahead? Why do they want to try and preempt the planning process and try and work out what's going on there and fix that? Dive down, deep drill into that. And then you've got some insight you can then try and bring to bear and try and get them to put more of the solutionizing into the actual execution of the plans rather than ahead of planning.
Great. And then the last question, I think, is from Steve Vansdale. He said, can testing responsibility be a decision of teams during PI planning? Or he said, chief product owner. I think he also might mean the product manager. So testing responsibility be a decision of the teams. I don't think they can choose their own quality levels, Steve, because obviously it doesn't matter which teams work on something, you want it done to the same consistent quality. So I don't think they can necessarily decide on the scope of that work. You want that described clearly as some sort of definition of done and other engineering kind of standards, and then you know that you'll get something consistent. Do the team sometimes have to interpret that slightly, based on the work that they're trying to do? Oh, absolutely. And I guess you're trusting then that they will make good decisions rather than try to cut corners. I don't necessarily see the testing responsibility being something that the product manager would make themselves necessarily. They're kind of relying on the engineering teams in the arts to really sort of give them the quality they want. They know about the scope and the business needs, but they obviously are not well placed to actually describe the quality attributes.
Yes. Quality is a technical concern, so it should always lie with the engineers and the architects and that strand. That we've built quality in, that we've gone through the process, well, that lies with the facilitators, scrum masters and release train engineer. But what quality is in terms of defining it lies with the engineering facility. have we built good quality, have the good quality functionality we've built, is it what the customers want? Well, that's a problem, a challenge for the product owners, product managers, but they're not quality directly. Not sure I fully understand the question enough to know whether we've properly answered that one, but hopefully we have somewhere in all of that.
Yeah. And I did say it was the last one, but another one snuck in. Stefan Winter has asked a question, and it's really about large solutions, which is a train of agile release trains. So even though we may have features in the PI planning, in the ARC backlog, they may be parts of a safe capability, which is basically sponsoring other features to be done at the same time in other trains in the same PI. And he says, how would you recommend to align on pooled features across arts in a solution context if teams have the autonomy to pull features and therefore features belonging to a capability might not be pulled in the same PI? I think the short answer is you have to line them up before to make sure that all of the features or none of the features are in scope prior to the PI planning. So that's the solution pre-PI planning, because actually the individual weighted shortest job first may not score them to move them all in scope necessarily. So you need to nudge them beforehand. And anything could happen during the PI planning. That's the reason why when Brian talked about having a management review meeting at the end of day one in PI planning, if you've got a large solution, once that meeting has taken place for each of the trains, then a subset of those people meet for the solution train. And this is exactly what they would be looking at. Have we got all of our features, likely to be in scope, or is there some big decision that we need to feed back to the individual trains to de-scope something or to accelerate a feature earlier in their PI planning? So that's the high level mechanism that Scaled Agile suggests, Steve, to kind of look at that. And you're basically actively managing that during the PI planning process, but of course you're probably only finding out every couple of hours, what features are in scope and whether they line up. They do suggest that you have a solution planning board for the large solution. So Brian showed the program board or the ARC planning board where it had each team in the train showing when the features would deliver. If you imagine it, you could do the same thing again, but with the large solution. And now each of the swim lanes would have the names of the trains, and you'd be showing the individual features that go to one of your single capabilities to show that if they are or are not in scope and have been planned. And so you look at that higher level to see whether things are under control. And that's one of the inputs that you'd look at that solution level management review meeting. Any
on a simple practical level, you can also add notes to the feature. So a feature that is part of a capability, you don't need massive backlog management structures for all this. You can just add a note to the feature that says, this train over here has the corresponding feature in their backlog. And that note is a trigger to the team. When they pull the feature and see the note, they then go, oh, we're going to have to contact the other train. So they'll have to pick up the phone or Zoom call, whatever the technology is we're using today, and then get in touch with the other train and find out if they've grabbed the feature yet, when it's been planned, and start those negotiations. First rule of scaling applies. The bigger this gets, the more release trains you've got, then the harder it becomes. As soon as you get to release train level, I'd always try and organize them to be stream aligned rather than complex subsystem. Otherwise, you're going to hit challenge after challenge.
Fantastic. And that takes us to the end of all of the questions. I don't think I've missed any, but apologies if I have. But I guess it just remains for us to thank you very much, everybody, for attending this. Hope you all found it useful. Really pleased to see so many people coming to join. We will make the materials available later on, so you'll be able to look at the slides. And just a word of thanks. Thank you very much, Brian, for your presentation.
That's all right. Hope it was useful. Recording should be available on the website shortly.
Indeed. Thank you, Brian. That's superb. And thank you, Keith, as well, for the question.